Hello, my name is Sondra Baras from Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, and I'm very, very honored and privileged to be invited to speak to you today about the Feast of Tabernacles, which is about to start in just a few days. So if we're going to, do a really comprehensive teaching on the Feast of Tabernacles, but let me qualify that in 45 minutes, we can't do a comprehensive teaching, but I am going to try to cover all the main bases. So there's a lot to talk about with the Feast of Tabernacles because it is a holiday that goes back to biblical times and it is mentioned in the Bible several times, and we're going to look at each of those times. But it is also a holiday that is celebrated today, and it has been celebrated in an uninterrupted fashion with not that much change for the past 2,000 years. Before that, when there was still a temple in Jerusalem, the celebration of the holiday was a bit different. And basically what we will see is the way the holiday is first commanded to us and discussed and described for us in the Bible, and then have a bit of an understanding of how we got to where we are today. Very, very much biblically based. Okay, so let's start with Scripture itself. And the first time that the holiday is mentioned is in the book of Exodus, chapter 23, verse 16. Now, here basically is, if we actually begin in verse 14, this is basically an overview of what we call the three pilgrimage festivals: Passover, Shavuot, or Pentateuch, or Festival of the Torah. There are different names for that, and Feast of Tabernacles, which is what we are about to celebrate now. So it begins as follows: 3 times a year you shall hold a festival for me. God is speaking to the nation. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, eating unleavened bread for 7 days, as I have commanded you at the set time of the month of Aviv, for in it you went forth from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. Okay, so we have the first, here it's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's also called Passover. And we have here the idea of, number one, you eat matzah, you eat unleavened bread, you don't eat the regular bread. But you also have that you're supposed to come. What does this mean? And none shall appear before me empty-handed. As we said, this is a pilgrimage festival. So in the times of the temple, all of the nation of Israel would go up to Jerusalem. And here it is telling us not just go up, but bring something with you. And we'll see later on in the Bible what that actually means. Then we have the second, and the Feast of the Harvest, which is what Shavuot is called in this place. The first fruits of your work and of what you sow in the field, and the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year. That's the Feast of Tabernacles, when you gather in the results of your work from the field. 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the sovereign, the Lord. Okay, so first of all, very important, in Hebrew, the word for appear is yera'eh, and it's very, very similar. In fact, it's the exact same letters, just slightly different vowels, as the word to see, yir'eh. And very often people confuse this and they say, oh, you're supposed to go to the temple to see the Lord. No, no, no. You're not going to see the Lord. You're going to be seen by the Lord. You need to be present. The Lord wants to see the nation of Israel present before him at the temple. So in this first mention of the Feast of Tabernacles, we don't even have this idea of a Feast of Tabernacles. Now in Hebrew, the holiday that translates from the Feast of Tabernacles, in other words, the original Hebrew, is Sukkot. Now Sukkot means a temporary dwelling, and a tabernacle is that same idea, a temporary dwelling. It's very interesting that in English, the same word tabernacle is used for the Mishkan, which is that temporary tent-like temple that is built in the desert. And it is also in the land of Israel at Shiloh. It is called a Mishkan, which really the word Mishkan refers to Shekhinah, refers to the presence of the Lord. It is a word that references the fact that this is where God will put his presence. And yet in English, they use the word tabernacle to reflect another aspect of that desert and later Shiloh structure, and that it is more temporary. The temple in Jerusalem is seen as the real permanent temple, and the Temple Mount is considered to be a place that remains holy forever. Once God put his presence in the temple, when Solomon dedicated the temple, the presence of God has never left the Temple Mount, as opposed to Shiloh. Once the tabernacle was destroyed, there is no more presence. I'm going through all of this just to give you an understanding of the source of the word tabernacle. But in Hebrew, it's two different words. The Sukkot, that is the word for the Feast of Tabernacles, refers to huts or booths, not to any kind of temple of any kind, but rather ordinary dwellings that people lived in. And we will see later in Scripture when that word shows up. But the first time we read about this holiday, there's no mention whatsoever of booths or tabernacles or anything else. This is a purely agricultural holiday. And in fact, all three of the pilgrimage festivals, as mentioned here in Exodus, revolve around agriculture. Okay, as you can see, these are all different times of the agriculture. Passover is the time of the beginning of the barley harvest. Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks, is the time of the wheat harvest and the first fruits. Okay, you bring the first fruits. And the final holiday, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, is the Feast of Ingathering, which means it's the end. Okay, you started the wheat harvest at the beginning of the summer. Now it's the end of the summer and you finished it. And you're kind of packing up. And this is also very interesting. I don't know if any of you have visited in Israel, but in my own community, for example, they discovered a kind of like a booth. It's made of stone, though, a small little hut made of stone that dates back to the First Temple period. And the understanding is that this is a place where, when during the harvest season, the farmers would be very concerned that people wouldn't come and steal the harvest. So they would post guards in the fields themselves to ensure that nobody was going to steal the harvest. And so one of these booths, these so-called booths, guard booths, we found in our community. Now, what would have happened here, the Feast of the Ingathering, which means we would close up those guard booths, okay, which is another agricultural understanding of this idea of a feast of temporary dwellings or feast of booths, because for this whole harvest period, beginning with the barley harvest in the early spring up until the end of the summer, which is now, you would have to have a presence out in the fields so that nobody would steal whatever it is you're harvesting and whatever is ripe at that period. And now you can fold it in and put it away, with this holiday. So that's also a certain agricultural element here. So anyway, that's what we see in the description in book of Exodus. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, as I'm sure you are aware of, is a chapter that is dedicated to all the feasts of the Lord. And it begins with, "These are my fixed times, the fixed times of the Lord. You shall proclaim as sacred occasions." Or people have translated fixed times as the Hebrew word is moed, but it's also translated as feast. We don't have to go into now all the etymology of that, but let's suffice it to say this is the chapter that people talk about when they're talking about the feast of the Lord. And again, it starts with Passover and moves on. Let's take a look right away. Go back. Let's go and look and see when we talk about Feast of Tabernacles here and what actually is said. Verse 33. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Say to the Israelite people, on the 15th day of this 7th month, there shall be the Feast of Booths to the Lord." Okay, so here, the booths is similar to tabernacles, okay, but we use for the first time the word Sukkot, which, as I explained, is really some kind of a booth or a hut. So this is what it's called here. We know it's the same as that other ingathering holiday because it's the same date, okay, but here it has a different name and it has a different description, a different focus. "The first day shall be a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupation. 7 days you shall bring offerings by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall observe a sacred occasion, and bring an offering by fire to the Lord. It is a solemn gathering. You shall not work at your occupation. Now, first of all, here we have a mention of sacrifices. Now, sacrifices were hinted at in Exodus because we know it's a pilgrimage festival, and God says you've got to show up. You have to appear before the Lord. And he says, don't come empty-handed. But here we have a different kind of sacrifices. These are the sacrifices that are brought in the name of the people, okay? It says 7 days you shall bring offerings. The you here is actually referring to the nation. And there's a difference in different kinds of offerings. An individual will bring an offering for his own sense of praise, thanksgiving, or sin offering or whatever. It's his own personal offering. And when we see that God says, don't show up empty-handed, that is an understanding that the individuals themselves should be bringing something. But the offerings that are mentioned here are the public offerings, the offerings that are brought in the temple by the priests on behalf of the entire nation of Israel. Now, we don't have the details of these offerings here, okay? We just know that there's going to be some. One thing I would point out, mentions here, we see this in other holidays as well. The first day is sacred occasion. The last day is a sacred occasion. In between is something in between, okay? And that, by the way, is something that we observe to this very day. The first day and the last day of the holidays are very similar to a Sabbath. We don't work. We don't use electricity. There's all kinds of things we don't do. We kind of set up the electricity in advance, but they're different kind of holidays. Very spending time with family in the synagogue, prayer, a much more spiritual day. The in-between days, now you're really not supposed to work on those in-between days either, unless you really have to, but they're still a holiday, but it's really a freer kind of holiday. It is less spiritual in nature. It's much more fun in nature. But anyway, that's how we look at this today. All right. Now, the verses, however, in Leviticus continue. At 37, we have another summary. These are the set times of the Lord that you shall celebrate as sacred occasions, bringing offerings by fire to the Lord, etc. And then in verse 39, we're going back to the Feast of Tabernacles. It's like an addendum. It's like, we talked about all the holidays. You got the point. But now we're going to get some extra detail about the Feast of Tabernacles. Mark, on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the yield of your land, you shall observe the festival of the Lord 7 days, a complete rest on the first day and a complete rest on the 8th day. On the first day, you shall take the product of hadar trees, that's citrus trees, essentially, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord 7 days. So here we suddenly have a whole new commandment that is introduced for the first time, what we call the 4 species. We take a product, a citrus fruit, which is what we say is an etrog, or a citron fruit. It's not a lemon. It's similar to a lemon, but it's its own kind of tree. Branches of palm trees, branches or whatever, small branches, twigs or whatever, of leafy trees, which is myrtle. Okay, this is what we're taking, the myrtle. And then we take willows of the brook. In other words, willows, whatever, the willows that grow by the rivers, etc. So we're taking these 4 things, and I'll explain later how we actually do that today. But this is something that you would rejoice with, okay? You shall observe it as a festival of the Lord for 7 days in the year. You shall observe it in the 7th month as a law for all time throughout the ages. Okay, you shall live in booths 7 days. Now, this is the first time we're having an understanding of the name that is given to the holiday here for the first time, a holiday of booths. Why is it called a holiday booths? Because we actually go out and live in these booths. Okay, and why do we live in these booths? You shall live in booths 7 days. All citizens in Israel shall live in booths in order that future generations may know that I made the Israelite people live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I, the Lord, your God. So here we have what we had until now was a agricultural element to the holiday. Here we have a historical element to the holiday. We all know Passover celebrates the Exodus from Egypt. Now we are learning that the actual dwelling in booths is also part of celebrating the Exodus from Egypt. It is celebrating the fact that while we were in the desert, God protected us, even though we were in these very flimsy tents and temporary structures. And so both holidays, 6 months apart, okay, are really celebrating this massive historical event of the Exodus from Egypt and the miracles that ensued just following the Exodus. And so that's also very, very important. And again, as I said, we have these new elements that have been in terms of what we're supposed to do. We have the 4 species, and we have actually dwelling in the booths. One more thing that we see here that we haven't seen before in the same way is this idea of celebration. We have the beginning of verse 41. And here I would take exception with the English translation. It says, you shall observe it as a festival, when the Hebrew word is you should celebrate it as a festival. So we have here this idea for the first time of joy, of celebration. It's not just this is a law and you're supposed to do it, but there is already introduced here the idea of joy and celebration. And that word celebration also appears in verse 39. Okay, now let's go on. In the book of Numbers, we have also discussion of the holiday. One second. Numbers chapter 29. And here the context is, again, you're having a list of all these holidays, but here the focus is on sacrifices. And if we saw before in the book of Leviticus, and that's actually very interesting because we would normally assume that the book of Leviticus is where you would have the details of the offerings because there's so many details of other offerings in the beginning of the book of Leviticus. But here, it is only in Numbers that we have the details. In the book of Leviticus, when it talks about the Feast of Tabernacles and all the feasts, it just kind of says, yeah, you're going to have sacrifices. Here we have the detail. And particularly with the Feast of Tabernacles, it's very, very detailed because every single day is listed separately, and every single day has a different number of animals that are brought. And actually, if you do the math, you will see that there are actually 70 bulls that are brought on the Feast of Tabernacles. It starts out with different, every day is a different number of bulls. And if you add them all together, you'll see that it starts with 12. The first day, it starts with 13, then 12, then 11 in descending order for all the days of the holiday. And if you add that all together, you will see there are 70 bulls. And that has actually been seen as a very symbolic number in our tradition. 70 has always been the archetypal number for the nations. How many nations are there? There's always 70. Now, it doesn't matter if they're actually 70 or not at any given time, but this is the number that is used to reflect the nations, okay? So from already going back to this scriptural reference that we have here in Numbers, Feast of Tabernacles is seen more than any of the other holidays, even though it does reference things that are happening to the nation of Israel, the harvest elements that are keyed to the climate and the harvest schedule in the land of Israel, and of course the historical element that's connected to the Exodus from Egypt, even though these are very particular to the nation of Israel kind of holidays, the Feast of Tabernacles has also always had a more universal element, and we'll delve into that a bit deeper shortly. But our first guess or our first hint of this is here when we see the number of bulls that are being sacrificed at 70 bulls, as I said, as opposed to 70 nations. Now, there's one other thing that we have here in this area that we haven't seen before, and that is in verse 35. On the 8th day, you shall hold a solemn gathering. You shall not work at your occupations. You shall present a burnt offering and an offering by the fire. It tells you about the different whatever they have to do. And what we have, what's unique here, is on the 8th day. Okay, now this is really a 7-day holiday. Okay, but the 8th day is something else. Whereas on Passover, it's a 7-day holiday, and there's the first day and the last day, which is the 7th day. Here, it's a 7-day holiday. Okay, and we can see that via the sacrifices. Every day is the same, except for different numbers of bulls, etc. And that goes through the 8th day, the 7th day. On the 8th day, we suddenly have a different name. On the 8th day, okay, it says, in my English, says you shall hold a solemn gathering. In Hebrew, it's atzeret. Remember that word, atzeret, because we're going to use it again later. Atzeret really just means like another festival. And basically what has happened is the 8th day of this holiday is like an addendum. It is not the flow of the holiday. First and last day is something special. In between is connected by these intermediate days. Rather, the last day of this is a separate holiday in and of itself. That's kind of added on as a bookend to the holiday, and it has its own elements to it, and we'll mention that briefly later. Okay, so that is how this is mentioned. What we see is basically the way it's written here, by the way, in what this added day is, the focus seems to be, I'm giving you an extra day to stay with me in the temple. Okay. And it's nice. Okay. It's like almost as if there's a sense that God is saying, I understand you, nation. You've come before me. You don't want to leave yet. So I'm going to give you an extra day. Okay, and that's really a beautiful, beautiful concept. Anyway, lastly, the final time that we see the Feast of Tabernacles discussed in the 5 books of Moses is in Deuteronomy 16. And again, we have the different holidays mentioned. And let's take a look at what we see about the Feast of Tabernacles. Here, it starts in verse 13. Here again, it's referred to the holiday of booths. So we are thinking more in terms of the historical booths as opposed to the agricultural, and yet it begins with an agricultural point. So it's kind of tying those two together. After the ingathering from your threshing floor and your vat, you shall hold the Feast of Booths for 7 days. Here we have both elements brought together, the historical and the agricultural. You shall rejoice in your festival with your son and daughter, your male and female slave, the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in your communities. You shall hold a festival. And again, this is rejoice in your festival. So we have rejoice, 2 different words. Rejoice, the samachta, is more like from the word of happiness. And tachog means celebrate. Okay. So you have 2 different terms that will refer to joy or happiness that is so important in this holiday. You shall rejoice in your festival. You shall celebrate. You shall have happiness. You shall hold a festival for the Lord. Again, I would say you should celebrate a festival for the Lord your God 7 days in the place the Lord will choose. For the Lord your God will bless all your crops and all your undertakings, and you have nothing but joy. So here again, we have a very short mention. It is in the context of the 3 pilgrimage festivals where everybody's supposed to come and be seen by the Lord in Jerusalem at the temple, before that in the tabernacle. But here the focus is on joy. We have a mention of agriculture, a mention of booths, but we have this idea of joy that is referred to over and over again. Okay. So we've now gone through the scriptures, and we basically showed how the various verses in the various books of first 5 books, each one brings its own emphasis. But now I want to go back and kind of talk about a little bit what's going on here. Each theme on its own and its own first. So first of all, we have the historical theme, the theme that relates to the Exodus from Egypt. And as we saw, we have the scripture that talks about remembering, sitting in these booths, not just to remembering, but also to pass on to the next generations, which is something that is also very, very vivid in the commandments with regard to Passover. The importance not just of remembering the Exodus, remembering how God saved us from Egypt, and brought us out to be his nation, but it's something that has to be passed on to the following generations. It becomes our responsibility. God is giving us a commandment and a way to do this, but it's clearly our responsibility to ensure that the generations to come and forever will always have this lesson. And one of the things that's so wonderful about the way the holidays are set up is that it's not just about storytelling. Storytelling changes over time. Storytelling can, die down. A few generations to come, there'll be another story that sounds maybe more relevant or more exciting. But what God has done through these commandments is giving us very practical things that we should do. And by doing them every year, and that does not change, it becomes a way to anchor the story. So, for example, we need to build the booths every year. And I don't know if you hear it. I'm actually taping this the day after Yom Kippur, just a couple days before Sukkot, okay? And I don't know if you just heard in the background, but someone was banging with a hammer on a nail, okay? Now, starting with right after the fast of Yom Kippur, which we completed yesterday evening, right away, people go out already and start to build their sukkah. Yes, Jews all over Israel and all over the world. When I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, we also put up a sukkah right after Yom Kippur, right after the Day of Atonement. And we go out and we build them. And they can be made of wood or canvas or anything. The main thing is it has to have at least 3 walls. And it cannot have a closed roof. The top can't be open either. It needs to have some kind of natural vegetative kind of thing. It could be bamboo poles. It can be palm leaves. It could be, in the States, we used to use evergreen branches. Some kind of a natural wood or, branch or something like that you're going to put across the top. It needs to cover a good part of it, but you still need to be able to see the sky through your roof. Okay. Now, what does this mean? Think about the lesson here. That God has said to us, we're supposed to remember that we sat in booths. What happens when you go into the desert and you sit in a booth? You are completely vulnerable. And we are supposed to reenact that level of vulnerability. When you're sitting in your house, we all have stone or brick or wood houses, but they're very, very sturdy. And they're built on very sturdy foundations. And they have very good roofs. And in fact, we invest heavily to ensure that our roofs don't leak. And when it's raining, the water doesn't come in. And if we see a leak, we immediately fix it. Okay. And, of course, in today's day and age, we're also very concerned about robbers or whatever. And so people have locks on their doors and they have alarm systems and they have locks on their windows and all these things. Okay. And here during this feast, we are leaving the safety of our very strong houses and going out into this little hut, a hut that has a flimsy wall, has a ceiling that maybe gives us some protection from the sun. That is what it's supposed to, a bit of protection from the sun, but it gives us no protection from the rain, no protection from the hot or cold or whatever it happens to be. Okay. No protection from robbers. Anybody can just, go in, cut your wood. You have absolutely no protection. What are you representing? You are saying, I am not only reenacting, but I am myself going out with this statement, I trust in God. Many people also see this idea of the sukkah, even then in the desert, not so much the idea of what the tents that they actually dwelled in, but as representing the clouds of glory that we know accompanied the nation of Israel. And they see the clouds of glory as a representation of God's protection. Okay. And so what we're doing in this holiday is doing 2 things. Number one, we're reenacting the idea of living in something temporary, but we're also trusting in God as if we could see those clouds of glory above us. Now, we don't see those clouds of glory anymore, but we know in our hearts, and this commandment enables us to reinforce this belief that God is protecting us. Okay, we don't need our locks in our windows and our roofs because God is protecting us. And that is particularly today in our situation when we in Israel are in the midst of a war where we have to know at all times where our nearest shelter is. And of course, we will continue to go into shelters if there are alarms. This is not a suicidal mission. It is a symbolic mission. But when we are not having sirens, the idea of being in a place like this, saying, yes, we know we are taking the normal precautions against missiles, but at the end of the day, who is our real protection? Our real protection is God. And it's such a meaningful way of showing this. And of course, this year, more than any other time in Israel, I would say we can really relate to that. So that's the historical element. The second element that we saw, which was actually the element that begins with it, is the agricultural element. And this is the final of the harvest feasts, okay? Things have finally finished with the harvest. Now, at this time of year in Israel, we've already begun the grape harvest. That begins usually in the middle of the summer. So by the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, we're almost finished with the grape harvest as well, although there may still be a little bit more to harvest, in the weeks to come. But it is a time when we're about to go into winter, and we have really, if we look over the past 6 months, we have enjoyed and we've been blessed by an enormous yield. And so the idea of the agricultural element is also to praise God for all the good he has given us. And we see that. We see that now. Now, in the first, I didn't mention this earlier. I neglected to mention this. But in the first mention of the holiday of the Feast of Tabernacles and Exodus, we talked about it being agriculturally related, but the context of these holidays is, within that chapter of 23, is all kinds of issues having to do with looking out for the weaker elements of society, making sure, for example, the law of the sabbatical year, every 7 years to lay, keep your fields fallow. Part of that is also to have a redistribution of the yield. That on that 7th year, whatever has grown spontaneously is not yours. It's everybody's. And in that context, you also have the Sabbath mentioned there. And this issue that is stressed in chapter 23 on the Sabbath is to make sure your animals, your servants, your entire household rests. So this agricultural element is also within the context of looking out, not just thanking God for the bounty, but what are you doing with your bounty? Making sure that you are distributing it well amongst the weaker elements of society. Okay, so that's the second element that we have here. The third element, of course, is the sacrifices. And as we saw, this was mentioned in both of them, but it is most detailed in the book of Numbers. So we talked about the 70 bulls. And here I want to show about how what begins as this idea of 70 bulls as relating to the nations of the world and creating a much more universalistic element to the holiday. This is translated into a number of different things that actually go into the holiday later on. So first of all, let's take a look at Zechariah. Zechariah mentions there's very little mention, by the way, of the holidays themselves in the books of the prophets. So when they are mentioned, it's certainly something we want to notice. Zechariah 14. So in Zechariah 14, there is a specific mention of the Feast of Tabernacles, of Sukkot. And it's actually a wonderful, wonderful verse. For many years, there has been a Feast of Tabernacles, a Christian festival here in Jerusalem, where Christians come from all over the world to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem. And the source of that custom is right here in Zechariah. So if you look at Zechariah 14, verse 16. This is a prophecy that talks about the end of days and a great cataclysmic happening that will be in a war, etc., the end of which becomes good things, okay? And this is one of the things it says, all who survive of all those nations that came up against Jerusalem. In other words, this is a battle against Jerusalem, and ultimately the people of Israel win. Okay, so now the scripture is saying, so what happens to all those nations who came up against Jerusalem, and they were punished, and many of them were killed. But now there's survivors. What happens to them? Here, the prophet is very clear. They shall make a pilgrimage year by year to bow low to the King, Lord of hosts, and to observe the Feast of Booths. Okay? Here, that is, in other words, it's not just that these people, it's universal and they should recognize God. But the vehicle by which they recognize God is to actually join the nation of Israel in the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, which I think is very special. Okay, now there are other elements that we know that took place in this holiday. We have very little written record of how the various holidays were celebrated in the First Temple period. What is mentioned in the books, the later books, the books of the prophets. Sometimes, or the writing sometimes gives us a sense, but we don't have details. We have more details from the Second Temple period in Jewish sources. Well, first of all, we have historian like Josephus, but we have, more importantly, Jewish sources, the Mishnah and the Talmud, which were written not that long after the destruction of the Second Temple, but also quotes people and their traditions that were passed along. They were actually living during the Second Temple period. So this gives us an understanding of how the holiday was celebrated. And one of the biggest parts of this holiday was to pray for rain. And we understand this. This holiday, we mark the end of the harvest. And in Israel, unlike in many other countries, certainly not like it is in the United States, we have rain only in the winter, and in the summer it's completely dry. And the agriculture is around that cycle, which means you're harvesting everything when there's already no more rain. And when you finished harvesting everything, then you better have rain because you're going to start planting. And whether you're planting or whether it's the trees that are now starting to produce the new fruit or whatever, it needs rain. And so this time of year, we are about to enter the winter months. And so it is very important to have rain. Now, I didn't read this part, but in Zechariah, the next verse, any of the earth's communities that does not make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to bow low to the King Lord of hosts shall receive no rain. However, if the community of Egypt does not make this pilgrimage, it shall not. Okay, but this is about Egypt is different. But in other words, rain is critical at this time of year, and so it becomes this incentive that the prophet is giving to the nations, that they're going to want to come up and pray to God because they're going to want to have that rain. So in the Jewish tradition, we certainly know this from the Second Temple period, there would be a prayer for rain. And one of the things they would do is throughout the week, those intermediate days, they would go down to the Shiloach, to the Githon spring that feeds Jerusalem, but it's outside the walls of Jerusalem. They would go down, they would gather up the water, walk back up and bring the water and pour it onto the altar. And then there would be great, great celebrations in the temple, all around this idea of praying for rain. Now, today, we actually, what we still have with that today is that on our last day of the holiday, what is called the Atzeret, Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of that extra holiday, we actually pray for rain. Okay, so that's very, very important. And that also has a very universal element to it, not just the way it's written in Zechariah, but rain affects everybody, affects humanity. And so this holiday, again, is a holiday that looks outward in a way that the other holidays do to a much lesser extent. Okay, now, another element we saw were the 4 species that are being brought, and we saw that, mentioned very specifically in, was it in Leviticus? Let me see. Anyway, I didn't write it down. I don't remember. Yes, in Leviticus, we saw for the first time. How does that translate, and what are we doing with that today? So you remember the palm branch. Okay, so we actually get a palm branch. It's called a lulav, okay? And we bind around it. We have these little things made out of, we create this little holder out of the palm branch itself, or one of these, palm things, and you create this holder, and in one of them, so in the middle part, you put the actual big palm branch. On each side, one side you have the willow and one side you have the myrtle, and you hold them together. And then you have the citron or the etrog, and you hold them together. And we take this with us to the synagogue. Now, we talked about the rejoicing and the thanksgiving to God for the harvest. So that comes to is expressed today in the synagogue. We sing the praises, what's called the Hallel prayer, the praises from Psalms, and we hold, as we're saying these prayers and we're singing them, we are holding this combination of the palm branch, the willow, the myrtle, and the citron, holding them together and waving them. And if you're thinking of Palm Sunday, this is a source, okay? Waving them, walking around the center of every synagogue is where the Torah scroll is brought out and read, walking around that center point, singing, dancing, waving this, and in that way, really expressing what it is, what we're supposed to be doing. Now, there is a great deal of symbolism in these that people talk about. So I'll just briefly, they talk about taste and smell. Taste represents Bible study and, let's say, closeness to God. And smell represents good deeds. And each of these things represents different kinds of people. Okay, the palm branch has its flavor, and here we're not talking about the branch itself, but the date. It's a date palm. The date itself has a wonderful flavor, but no smell. Okay, the citron has both flavor and smell. The myrtle has a smell, but no flavor. And the willow has nothing, no flavor, no smell. And this represents different types of people. There are people who are very involved in spirituality, but they don't do such good things. They're not involved in doing good works. And then there are people who do good works, but they're not so involved in getting close to God. And then there are people who do absolutely nothing. They have no spiritual side to them. They don't do good works. They're just whatever, nothings. And then you have people who, of course, are the ultimate, represented by the citron, who both are very involved in getting close to God and at the same time involved in doing good things. So the binding of all these people together is a way of saying that we all can come before the Lord, whether we're good people or bad people or in between people. Okay, we are all coming together and coming before the Lord. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful understanding. Okay, and then lastly, I just want to talk about joy, because joy is something we saw that was focused in. There's mention of joy and rejoicing in all the different, or most of the scriptural references, but most importantly, most stressed more than anywhere else in the Deuteronomy discussions of the holiday. And it is, we talked about all these things that we mentioned really come together, the rejoicing in God, the thanking God of the harvest, the rejoicing in where we are today. Rejoicing is very, very important in this holiday. And I would just, end with a little note. We talked about the final day of the holiday. It's called Shmini Atzeret in the Bible, that eighth last day. And over time, we had added content to the day to make it a day that we also rejoice in the completion of the annual cycle of the reading of the Torah portions. In other words, right after the holiday of the Feast of Tabernacles, we'll begin reading with Genesis, and we complete the end of Deuteronomy on this day, on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, this extra Shmini Atzeret day. And over the centuries, it developed into a certain type of holiday that is not this element of it was added to the holiday after the Bible, and that is rejoicing in the completion of the Torah. But again, we have this idea of rejoicing, and I think that theme of rejoicing and celebrating is so strong for us all throughout this holiday of the Feast of Tabernacles, coming to a real climax on that last day. And I just want to make a mention. It's, a year ago, October 7th, that was on that last day of the holiday. It was on Simchat Torah, the day that we rejoice in the completion of the Torah. And as we're singing and dancing in the synagogue, little by little, word comes in what's going on in the South. And today, as we approach that holiday, it is really a challenge to find a way to continue to rejoice, to thank God, to sing his praises, to rejoice in the Torah, to rejoice in the Bible, which is something we all want to do. And somehow find that balance between that same rejoicing and yet remembering the terrible massacre that began last year, just a year ago, on that same day, and the consequences of which are following us through to this very day. That is our challenge this year. And somehow we will find a way. We will be happy. We will rejoice, because that is something God commands us to do. And yes, God can command us to be happy. And we find ways to be happy, because there is always a reason to be happy. In our darkest moments, we can always find a reason to be happy, happy to look around us, look what we do have to thank God for. And of course, at the same time, continue to pray for salvation, for peace, and for return of our hostages. Have a wonderful week. Enjoy however you're celebrating this holiday, or if you do celebrate it. And if you don't, that's also great. Just giving you a bit of a understanding of how we, the people of Israel, are celebrating these holidays. Thank you.